The candle had burned down to a stub, and still Edmund Ashworth could not sleep. Somewhere below him, in the great hall of Havelock House, a clock struck 2, and the sound rolled through the empty corridors like a warning nobody wanted to hear. He sat up in the dark, his heart pounding for no reason he could name, and reached for the letter opener on his nightstand before he even realized his hand was shaking. 6 years of silence had trained his body to expect nothing, and yet tonight something in the house felt wrong, charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He rose, pulled on a robe, and walked to the window. The moon hung low over the frozen gardens, and for a moment he thought he saw a shape moving near the old stone wall at the edge of the property, close to where his wife Charlotte was buried. It was gone before he could be certain, swallowed by shadow, and he told himself it was nothing more than a fox or a trick of tired eyes. But his pulse did not slow. Something had changed in the air of Havelock House, and Edmund Ashworth, who had spent 6 years teaching himself not to feel anything at all, felt fear again for the first time since the funeral. He was 34 years old, and to the people of the county, he was known simply as the Grim Duke, the man who had shut his doors to the world the winter his young wife died. There had been a fire that night, a fire that took her from him in a matter of minutes, and though the physicians had called it an accident, Edmund had never quite believed the story that was given to him. He had asked questions once in the raw weeks after and been told gently by everyone around him to let the matter rest, to grieve and move forward, that questioning a tragedy would not bring her back. So he had stopped asking. He had closed the ballroom, dismissed most of the staff who reminded him of that night, and retreated into the kind of solitude that swallows a man whole. He had not danced since. He had not laughed, not truly, not in a way that reached his eyes. He managed his estates with cold efficiency, rode alone at dawn before the servants woke, and dined in a room built for 40 people, sitting at one end of a long table with only the sound of his own fork against china for company. His steward, a steady and devoted man named George Whitmore, had long since given up trying to coax him into society. The other lords of the county whispered about him at their card tables, calling him haunted, calling him cursed, and Edmund let them talk because the truth, whatever it was, felt far worse than any rumor they could invent. That morning, hours after the strange feeling in the night, Edmund came down to breakfast to find his butler, a composed and careful man named Hargrove, standing near the sideboard with an unusual stillness about him. Hargrove had served the family for 30 years and rarely showed anything on his face, but this morning there was something there, a flicker of hesitation, as though he were holding a secret he did not want to deliver. Edmund noticed it immediately. He had learned in his years of silence to read the smallest details in a room, because details were often the only company he kept. "You look as though the house is on fire, Hargrove," he said, taking his seat. "Forgive me, your grace," Hargrove answered and lifted a silver tray from the sideboard. "There is a letter. It arrived last night, quite late, by a writer none of the staff recognized. I did not wish to disturb you at that hour, given the weather." Edmund frowned. Havelock House received little correspondence beyond estate business, tenant requests, and the occasional dry letter from a solicitor in London. A writer arriving after midnight in the cold was not ordinary. "Set it here," he said, and Hargrove placed the tray before him and withdrew a few steps, though he did not leave the room, which was itself unusual. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and sealed with plain red wax bearing no crest that Edmund recognized. His name was written across the front in a hand he did not know, elegant but firm, the kind of penmanship that suggested confidence rather than delicacy. He turned it over twice before breaking the seal, some instinct in him hesitating the way a man hesitates before stepping onto ice he is not sure will hold his weight. Inside was a single card, cream like the envelope, edged in a thin band of silver. It was an invitation, formally worded, to a gathering at Ashcombe Manor 2 weeks hence, hosted by a name he did not immediately place. Below the formal wording, in smaller and more personal handwriting, someone had added a single line that made his chest tighten in a way he had not felt in years. "You danced with me once when we were children, and you promised you would again someday. I am calling in that promise now, before it is too late for either of us." There was no signature beyond a single initial, an E, and no explanation of who this person was or how they knew of a promise Edmund himself had almost forgotten. He sat very still, the card between his fingers, and felt the strange sensation of the previous night settle over him again, heavier this time, as though the shape in the garden and the card on the table were somehow the same warning arriving twice. "Hargrove," he said slowly, "do you know anything of this rider or of Ashcombe Manor?" "The manor has stood empty for some years, your grace, since old Baron Whitfield passed," Hargrove said carefully. "I understand a relation has recently returned to take up residence there. Beyond that, I know very little." Whitfield? The name struck something distant in Edmund's memory. A summer many years ago, before his marriage, before the fire, when he had been a young man of 17 visiting a neighboring estate with his father. There had been a girl there, younger than him by a year or two, with quick eyes and a habit of laughing at things she was not supposed to find funny. He remembered a garden party, a small orchestra, and a clumsy dance on the lawn where he had stepped on her slippers twice, and she had told him, quite seriously, that he had better practice before he was allowed to dance with anyone important. He remembered promising her, half in jest, that he would dance with her again one day properly when he had learned how. He had not thought of that promise in 17 years. He had certainly not expected it to return to him wrapped in silver-edged paper on the very night something unseen moved through his garden. He should have set the card aside. He nearly did, telling himself it was nothing more than a strange coincidence, an old acquaintance grown sentimental with time. But something about the timing unsettled him deeply, the shadow near Charlotte's resting place the night before, the unfamiliar rider arriving after midnight, the sudden reappearance of a promise from a life that felt as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Edmund Ashworth did not believe in omens. He had stopped believing in most things the night his wife died. And yet he could not shake the feeling that this card had not arrived by chance, and that ignoring it would be far more dangerous than accepting it. He spent the rest of the morning in his study, staring at columns of figures he could not focus on, the card propped against an inkwell where he could see it from every angle of the room. Around midday, George Whitmore arrived with reports on the northern tenant farms, and found his employer in a state he had not seen in years, distracted, restless, glancing again and again toward a small piece of cream-colored paper as though it might move on its own. "Is something wrong, your grace?" Whitmore asked, setting down his ledgers. Edmund did not answer immediately. He rose instead and walked to the window that overlooked the eastern gardens, the same direction he had looked the night before when he thought he saw a shape near the stone wall. "Whitmore," he said finally, "has anyone reported strangers on the estate in recent days? Anyone near the old chapel grounds or the family plot?" Whitmore's expression shifted, a careful blankness settling over features that had, until that moment, been open and easy. It was a small change, barely noticeable, but Edmund had spent 6 years learning to notice small things, and he caught it. "Nothing has been reported to me, your grace," Whitmore said, a beat too quickly. Edmund turned from the window and studied his steward, a man he had trusted without question since the day he inherited the title. For 6 years Whitmore had managed every detail of Havelock's affairs with a loyalty that seemed unshakable, and yet in that single moment, Edmund felt the first thread of doubt he had allowed himself to feel about anyone in a very long time. "If anything is reported," he said slowly, "I want to know immediately. Anything at all." "Of course, your grace," Whitmore answered, and gathered his ledgers rather more quickly than usual before excusing himself from the room. Edmund stood alone in his study for a long while after the door closed, the winter light fading gray across the floor, and found himself thinking not of tenant farms or unpaid rents, but of fire, of shadows in a frozen garden, and of a girl who had once told a young lord he needed practice before he could dance with anyone important. He picked up the silver-edged card again and read the line at the bottom a second time, then a third, and felt something stir in his chest that he had buried so deeply he had almost forgotten its name. It was not quite hope. It was closer to alarm, the sense that a door long sealed shut had been quietly tried from the other side, and that whoever stood behind it now knew exactly how to make him open it. That evening, as the house settled into its usual silence, Edmund did something he had not done in 6 years. He walked, alone and without a lantern, down through the frozen gardens toward the family plot at the edge of the estate, following the exact path where he thought he had seen movement the night before. The cold bit through his coat, and his boots crunched over frost-hardened grass, and with every step the strange unease from the previous night returned, stronger now, as though the ground itself remembered something he did not. He reached the low iron gate that marked the family plot and stopped. In the moonlight he could see Charlotte's headstone, pale and still, exactly as it had stood for 6 years. But beside it, pressed into the frost at the base of the stone, was something that had not been there before. A single white flower, freshly cut, its stem still faintly green against the frozen ground, lying where no gardener of his had planted anything in years. Edmund knelt slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air, and stared at the flower as though it might explain itself. Someone had been here. Someone had walked through his private gardens, past his silent house, and left this small, deliberate mark at his wife's grave. On the same night, an unknown rider delivered an invitation carrying a promise from a girl he had not seen in 17 years. It was too precise to be coincidence, and too strange to be comfort. He rose, his heart beating hard against his ribs, and looked back toward the house, its dark windows watching him like closed eyes. For 6 years Havelock House had been a place of grief, quiet and unchanging, a tomb he had built around himself brick by brick. But standing there in the frost with a stranger's flower at his feet and a stranger's card in his pocket, Edmund Ashworth understood, with a certainty he could not explain, that the silence of those 6 years was about to end, whether he was ready for it or not. He did not sleep again that night. He sat by the fire in his study until dawn, turning the silver-edged card over in his hands, thinking of the flower in the frost, the shape in the shadows, and the careful blankness that had crossed his steward's face at the mention of the family plot. Something was moving beneath the surface of his quiet life, something patient and deliberate, and whether it was danger or deliverance, Edmund could no longer pretend he had not felt it arrive. By the time the sun rose gray and thin over the eastern hills, he had made his decision. He would attend the gathering at Ashcombe Manor. He would look the writer of that card in the eye and ask her plainly who had sent that writer, and why, on the very night before the invitation arrived, someone had walked through his gardens to leave a flower at his wife's grave. He told himself it was only caution, only the natural vigilance of a man protecting his home. But some quieter part of him, a part that had been silent for 6 long years, whispered that it was something else entirely, that the promise on that card had reached further into him than he wanted to admit, and that whatever waited at Ashcombe Manor, he could no longer stay away from it. He rang for Hargrove before the household had properly woken, and when the old butler appeared, still fastening the last button of his coat, Edmund handed him the silver-edged card without a word of explanation. "Send my acceptance to Ashcombe Manor today," he said. "And Hargrove, one more thing. I want the grounds watched from tonight forward, quietly. No one is to know why." Hargrove's eyes moved briefly to the card, then back to his master's face, and something like relief passed over his features, so faint it might have been imagined. "As you wish, your grace," he said, and for the first time in 6 years, Edmund Ashworth thought he heard something like hope in an old man's voice. The road to Ashcombe Manor was longer than Edmund remembered, winding through bare hedgerows and frost-covered fields under a sky the color of old pewter. He rode alone, refusing the company of outriders despite Hargrove's quiet objections, telling himself he needed the silence to think. In truth, he needed the silence because his mind would not stop turning over the flower at Charlotte's grave, the shape in the shadows, and the careful blankness that had crossed Whitmore's face 2 mornings before. Something was wrong beneath the surface of his own household, and he intended to understand it before he trusted anyone with what he had seen. Ashcombe Manor rose out of the mist just past noon, its gray stone walls softened by ivy that had grown wild during the years the house stood empty. Smoke curled from several chimneys now, and lamps burned in windows that had been dark for a long time, and Edmund felt an odd tightness in his chest at the sight of it, as though the house itself were waking from a long sleep, much like he was. A groom took his horse at the gate, and a footman led him through a hall being hastily restored to its former grandeur, furniture still draped in some rooms, fresh paint drying in others. It was clear the new mistress of Ashcombe had returned to a house in need of considerable care, and clear, too, that she had wasted no time beginning that care herself. He was shown into a drawing-room where perhaps a dozen guests had already gathered, minor gentry from the surrounding county, and he felt every eye turned toward him the moment he entered, the way eyes always turned toward a man who had not been seen at any gathering in 6 years. He did not see her at first. He was searching for a face he barely remembered, a girl of 16 grown into a woman he could not picture, and so his eyes passed over her twice before something in her posture, a particular stillness in the way she stood near the window watching the door rather than the room, made him stop. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair pinned simply and eyes that held his gaze without the polite retreat. Most young ladies offered a duke of his reputation. She wore mourning gray, though whether for the old baron or some more private grief he could not tell, and there was a composure about her that reminded him, uncomfortably, of himself. "Your Grace," she said, crossing the room before anyone could introduce them properly, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment and did not intend to let convention delay it. "I am glad you came. I was not certain you would." "I nearly did not," he admitted, because something in her directness demanded honesty rather than pleasantries. "Forgive me, but I do not believe I would have recognized you." "Eleanor Whitfield," she said, and something flickered behind her eyes, amusement perhaps, or relief. "You stepped on my slippers twice at my father's garden party, 17 years ago, and told me you would make a fine dancer one day if I would only be patient with you." The memory returned to him fully then, sudden and vivid, a summer lawn, an out-of-tune orchestra, and a girl laughing at his clumsiness instead of scolding him for it. He found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, almost smiling. "I remember a rather blunt young lady informing me I needed practice," he said. "I stand by the assessment," she answered, and there it was again, that flicker of humor beneath the composed surface, and Edmund felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Some tension he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there at all. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes before other guests drew her attention away, and in that short time Edmund learned that Eleanor had spent the last several years abroad with an aunt in Italy, following her father's death, and had only recently returned to claim Ashcombe and settle its considerable debts. She spoke plainly about the difficulties of the estate, the tenants who needed reassurance, the accounts that needed untangling, and Edmund found himself offering advice before he realized he had decided to help her at all. It felt strange, speaking so easily to someone, after years of measuring every word before it left his mouth. He asked her carefully about the rider who had delivered her invitation so late at night. "I sent no rider after dark," she said, her brow creasing. "My invitations went out 3 days ago by my own footman in the afternoon. Why do you ask?" Edmund hesitated. He did not yet know her well enough to speak of shadows in his garden or flowers left at his wife's grave, and something in him, some old instinct for caution, told him to hold the truth back a little longer. "A misunderstanding," he said. "Forgive me." She studied him for a moment, clearly unconvinced, but did not press further, and Edmund understood with a small jolt of surprise that she was choosing to trust him with his silence, the way one careful person sometimes trusts another. The gathering continued through the afternoon, and Edmund found himself drawn into conversation more than he had been in years, though he remained watchful, his eyes moving often to the doors and windows, some part of him still braced for the shape he had seen in his own garden 2 nights before. It was during one such glance toward the window that he noticed a man standing slightly apart from the other guests, a tall gentleman in dark green with sharp, assessing eyes, watching Eleanor with an intensity that had nothing pleasant in it. "Who is that?" Edmund asked quietly of an older gentleman standing near him, a Colonel Ashby who had known the Whitfield family for decades. "Henry Colton," the colonel said, lowering his voice. "His family holds the land bordering Ashcombe to the east. There was some understanding, before the old baron died, that Colton might one day marry into the family and settle the boundary dispute between the estates. Miss Whitfield's return has rather complicated his expectations." Edmund watched Colton a moment longer, noting the way the man's jaw tightened whenever Eleanor laughed at something another guest said, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides as though restraining some sharper impulse. It was the look of a man who believed something belonged to him and resented discovering it did not. And Edmund, who had spent 6 years reading danger in small gestures, because grief had taught him nothing else, felt a cold certainty settle over him that Henry Colton would not accept losing gracefully, whatever it was he believed he was owed. Later, as the light began to fade and guests gathered their cloaks, Edmund found a moment alone with Eleanor near the entrance hall. "Thank you for the promise you called in," he said. "I had nearly forgotten I made it." "I never forget a promise, Your Grace," she said, and then more quietly, "nor do I forget a kindness. I heard what happened to your wife. I am sorry for it. I did not send that invitation lightly, hoping to disturb an old grief. I sent it because I remembered a boy who was kind to a stubborn girl on a summer lawn, and I thought perhaps that boy might need a reason to step outside his own walls again." Edmund said nothing for a moment, the words settling into him with an unexpected weight. No one had spoken to him so plainly about Charlotte in years, without flinching, without the careful pity that usually accompanied any mention of his loss. "I have been outside my own walls exactly twice in 6 years," he said finally, "once for a funeral that was not my wife's, and once today." "Then I am glad today was the second time," she said, and there was nothing performed in the way she said it, nothing calculated for effect, only a simple honesty that struck him harder than any flattery could have. He rode home in the deepening dusk with his mind full of her, the directness of her, the way she had looked at him without the careful distance others kept, as though his grief did not frighten her the way it frightened everyone else. But beneath that warmth ran a colder current, the memory of Henry Colton's tightened jaw, the certainty that a man who felt entitled to a woman's hand did not simply step aside because she chose otherwise. And beneath that current ran a colder one still, the flower at Charlotte's grave, the shape in his garden, the strange writer who had not, by Eleanor's own account, been sent by her at all. Someone else had known about the invitation. Someone else had used it, or watched it, or followed its path to his door with purposes of their own. And that same night, someone had walked through his private gardens to leave a mark at his wife's resting place, as though reminding him, or warning him, that the past he thought buried was not buried nearly as deeply as he believed. When he reached Havelock House, full dark had fallen, and Hargrove met him at the door with an expression that told Edmund immediately something had happened in his absence. "Your Grace," the butler said, his voice low and careful, "one of the grounds men reports a stranger seen near the eastern wall this afternoon, close to the family plot. He gave chase, but the man escaped over the boundary hedge before he could be identified." Edmund felt the cold certainty in his chest sharpen into something closer to alarm. "Did he see anything of the man's face?" Edmund asked. "Anything at all?" "Only that he wore dark green, Your Grace," Hargrove said. "A fine coat, not a laborer's clothing. The groundsman was quite certain of that much." Dark green. The same color Henry Colton had worn that very afternoon at Ashcombe Manor, watching Eleanor with a jealousy that had nothing gentle in it. Edmund stood in his own entrance hall, the cold of the evening still clinging to his coat, and felt the quiet, ordinary shape of his life shifting beneath him into something far more dangerous than he had allowed himself to believe that morning, when a single card had seemed like nothing more than an old promise finally called due. Edmund did not sleep well that night either, and by the time morning came, he had resolved to do something he had avoided for 6 long years. He would look again, properly, at the circumstances of the fire that killed his wife. He had accepted, in the numb months after her death, the story he had been given, that a candle had fallen in her sitting room while she read alone, that the flames caught the curtains before anyone could reach her, that it was a terrible accident and nothing more. He had accepted it because grief left him no strength to question it, and because everyone around him, his own steward included, had urged him gently and repeatedly to let the matter rest. Now, with a flower pressed into frost at her grave, and a stranger in dark green fleeing across his eastern boundary, he found he could no longer afford that particular comfort. He began in the household records, ledgers kept meticulously by Whitmore since long before Charlotte's death, recording every servant employed at Havelock House and every wage paid. He searched for the names of the staff who had been present that night, intending simply to speak with them again, to ask questions he had been too broken to ask the first time. It was there, in the careful columns of Whitmore's own handwriting, that he found the first true crack in the story he had believed for 6 years. 3 servants who had been present the night of the fire, according to the ledger, had left Havelock's employment within a month of Charlotte's death, each departure recorded with a brief, tidy note. A housemaid named Susan Price, dismissed for theft. A footman named Daniel Marsh, departed to seek work in London. A groundsman named Old Tobias, retired due to age and infirmity. Edmund had never questioned these departures at the time. Grief had made him blind to everything but his own pain, and Whitmore had managed the household smoothly through those terrible weeks, sparing him every difficulty he could. But now, reading the entries with a clearer eye, Edmund noticed something that chilled him. All 3 departures were recorded in the same week, within days of each other, and all 3 were witnessed and signed not by Charlotte's own lady's maid, who might reasonably have handled such matters, but by Whitmore himself in every case, with no second signature at all. It was not impossible for a steward to manage such affairs alone. But it was unusual, and unusual was enough now to make Edmund's pulse quicken. He found Whitmore in the estate office that afternoon, bent over correspondence, and set the old ledger down on the desk between them without preamble. "Tell me about Susan Price," he said, "and Daniel Marsh and Old Tobias." Whitmore's face did something Edmund had never seen it do before. It went, very briefly, entirely still, the way a hare goes still when it senses a hawk overhead, before smoothing itself back into careful composure. "They left Havelock's service some years ago, Your Grace," he said. "Surely you recall the circumstances, difficult as that time was for all of us." "I recall almost nothing of that time," Edmund said, his voice low and even because I was not fit to recall anything at all. "You managed the household in my place, and I trusted you completely to do so honestly. I am asking you now plainly whether that trust was well placed." Something passed behind Whitmore's eyes, and for a moment Edmund thought the older man might simply answer, might set down whatever burden he had carried alone for 6 years. But instead Whitmore straightened, his expression settling into the practiced neutrality of a servant who has decided, deliberately, to say nothing further. "Your Grace has had a difficult few days," he said carefully. "Perhaps it would be wise to rest, rather than dwell on matters long since settled." It was not an answer. It was, Edmund realized with a cold certainty, a deflection, the same kind of careful redirection he had used himself for years to avoid conversations about Charlotte, and hearing it turned back toward him told him more than any confession could have. Whitmore knew something. Whitmore had known something for 6 years, and had chosen, for reasons Edmund could not yet guess, to keep it buried along with everything else. He did not press further that day. He had learned, in his years of solitude, that patience revealed more than confrontation, and he suspected that whatever Whitmore was hiding would not survive close, careful attention for long. Instead, he turned his efforts toward finding the 3 former servants, sending quiet inquiries through channels Whitmore would not think to watch, a solicitor in the county town, a contact of Colonel Ashby's who handled such discreet matters for half the great houses in the region. 3 days later, a reply came regarding Daniel Marsh. The former footman had not, in fact, gone to London as the ledger claimed. He had taken a position at a coaching inn some 15 miles south under his own name, and had lived there quietly ever since, apparently untroubled by any need for secrecy. Edmund rode out himself alone on a gray morning that threatened rain, and found the man exactly where the inquiry had placed him, older now, heavier, but recognizable. Marsh went pale the moment he saw who had walked into the inn's small tap-room, and for a moment Edmund thought the man might bolt entirely. But something in Edmund's face, some visible exhaustion of grief finally seeking its answer rather than avoiding it, seemed to soften whatever fear held the former footman in place. "I wondered if you would ever come asking," Marsh said quietly, once they had found a private corner. "I have waited 6 years, Your Grace, wondering whether it was cowardice or kindness that kept me silent, and I confess I still do not know which it was." "Tell me," Edmund said, "whatever it is. I have carried the not knowing long enough." Marsh's account, delivered haltingly and with evident discomfort, painted a picture Edmund had never imagined. On the night of the fire, Marsh had been on duty in the servants' hall, and had seen Whitmore leave the house through the side entrance some time after midnight, well before the alarm was raised, carrying something wrapped in cloth that Marsh had not been able to identify. He had thought little of it at the time. Servants moved through the house at all hours on countless small errands, but when the fire broke out barely half an hour later in the Duchess's private sitting room, and when Whitmore returned through that same side door looking, in Marsh's words, like a man who had seen his own grave, the footman had begun to wonder. He had said nothing at the time, grief and shock consuming the household entirely, and within weeks Whitmore had quietly arranged his departure, offering a generous sum of money and a recommendation for the coaching in position, along with a clear, unspoken understanding that Marsh's silence on the matter of that night would be well rewarded, and his speech on it would not. "I do not say he set the fire himself, Your Grace," Marsh said carefully. "I never saw such a thing, and I would not accuse a man falsely. But I know what I saw, and I know that a man does not pay another man to forget an ordinary evening." Edmund rode home through the gathering rain with Marsh's words turning over and over in his mind, each pass sharpening into something closer to horror. Whitmore, the steady and devoted steward who had managed his household with unwavering loyalty for 30 years, who had guided him gently through the worst grief of his life, who had, only days before, urged him to let the matter of the past rest quietly. Whitmore, who had signed alone the departure of 3 servants who had witnessed something on the night Charlotte died. It was not proof of murder. It was not even proof of anything beyond a secret carried and a payment made. But it was enough, more than enough, to make Edmund understand that the fire which took his wife's life might never have been the accident he had spent 6 years believing it to be. He said nothing to Whitmore of what he had learned. Instead, over the following days, he watched his steward with the same careful attention he had once reserved for grief, noting small things. The way Whitmore's eyes flicked toward the eastern boundary whenever it was mentioned, the way he seemed, subtly but unmistakably, to discourage any further discussion of Ashcombe Manor or Eleanor Whitfield at all. Meanwhile, Edmund's correspondence with Eleanor continued, brief formal letters at first regarding estate matters they had discussed at their first meeting, and then, gradually, letters that carried less formality and more of themselves within them. She wrote of the tenants at Ashcombe, of the difficulties of restoring a house long neglected, and once, in a letter that made Edmund read it 3 times before setting it down, she wrote of her own mother's death when Eleanor was a child, and the years of silence that had followed, and how she had learned, slowly and painfully, that silence was not the same thing as peace. He found himself riding to Ashcombe more often than estate business strictly required, and found, each time, that Eleanor met him with the same unguarded directness she had shown at their first meeting, neither performing grief for his benefit nor pretending it did not exist, simply meeting him as he was, which was more than anyone else in 6 years had managed to do. It was during one such visit, walking together through Ashcombe's half-restored gardens beneath a pale winter sun, that Eleanor mentioned, almost in passing, something that made Edmund stop entirely. "Henry Colton called on me again yesterday," she said, her voice carefully neutral in a way that told Edmund she had chosen her words deliberately. "He was less than pleased to learn of your visits here. He said something rather strange, in fact, something about old debts finally coming due, and old secrets finding their way home. I did not entirely understand him, and when I asked him to explain himself, he only smiled and changed the subject. Edmund felt the cold certainty from the coaching inn settle over him again, colder now, sharper, twin threads of danger drawing closer together in his mind. A steward with a 6-year secret. A rival with a grudge and a fondness for dark green coats, seen fleeing across the eastern boundary, the very night a stranger's flower appeared at Charlotte's grave. He did not yet know how the threads connected, whether they connected at all, but he knew, with the same instinct that had once told him something was wrong in his own garden before he ever saw the flower, that Henry Colton's talk of old secrets finding their way home was not idle conversation, and that whatever quiet danger had been circling Havelock House for 6 years was now circling Ashcombe Manor as well, drawn there by nothing more than the simple fact that Edmund had finally, after all this time, allowed himself to care for someone again. Edmund did not mention Whitmore's secret to Alina, not yet. He told himself it was caution, a wish to be certain before he burdened her with suspicions he could not fully prove, but in truth it was something closer to fear, a reluctance to let the darkness he carried touch the fragile, unfamiliar warmth that had begun to grow between them. He had spent 6 years believing warmth was something the world no longer owed him, and he found himself, absurdly, afraid that speaking of murder and secrets aloud might somehow prove that belief correct. Instead, he continued his quiet investigation, this time turning his attention to old Tobias, the groundsman whose retirement the ledger had recorded so tidily alongside Marsh's departure and Susan Price's dismissal. Tobias, it turned out, had not gone far at all. He lived in a small cottage on the edge of Havelock's own land, granted to him, according to the estate records, as a kindness for his long service. Edmund found this detail strange the moment he considered it properly. A man dismissed for infirmity was rarely granted a cottage on his former employer's land, close enough that news of him might easily reach the house. It was, Edmund realized, exactly the sort of arrangement a guilty man might make to keep a witness close and quiet, rather than sending him far away where his silence could not be so easily assured. He rode to the cottage himself on a cold, bright morning and found Tobias sitting by a small fire, older and more frail than Edmund remembered, but sharp-eyed still. The old man's hands trembled slightly when he recognized his visitor, though whether from age or apprehension Edmund could not tell. "I wondered how long it would take, Your Grace," Tobias said, echoing Marsh's own words so closely that Edmund felt a chill pass through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. "I told myself, these 6 years, that if you ever came asking I would tell you everything, whatever it cost me. I am too old now to carry secrets to my grave out of fear for my own comfort." "Tell me," Edmund said, and sat down across from the old man without waiting to be invited, because 6 years of patience had finally exhausted itself entirely. Tobias's account confirmed what Marsh had described, and added to it a detail that turned Edmund's blood cold. He had seen that same night a second figure near the house shortly before the fire broke out, a man in a dark coat whom he had not recognized at the time, standing near the stable yard in conversation with Whitmore himself, their voices low and urgent, though Tobias had been too far away to hear the words exchanged. He had thought nothing of it until the fire began, and even then had assumed it merely an unhappy coincidence, a tradesman perhaps, come about some late business. It was only years later, seeing the same man's face at a county fair, that Tobias had realized who he had seen that night. "It was young Colton, Your Grace," Tobias said quietly. "Not the elder Colton who held the land then, but his son, the one who holds it now. I did not think much of it at the time. A young man of that family had no particular reason to visit Havelock after dark, but I have thought of little else in the years since, wondering what business could bring him here so quietly, and why he never mentioned it, not once, in all the years that followed." Edmund rode home from Tobias's cottage with a fury building in his chest that he had not felt since the earliest days of his grief, a fury made sharper by 6 years of suppression finally breaking its bounds. Henry Colton had been at Havelock House the very night Charlotte died, speaking privately with the steward who had, in the weeks that followed, paid 3 separate servants to forget what they had seen. It was not proof of murder, not yet, not in any way a magistrate would accept. But it was enough, entirely enough, to confirm what some part of Edmund had suspected since the moment he read Colton's tightened jaw at Ashcombe Manor, that the man's ambitions toward the Whitfield estate were not new, and that his interest in controlling both Ashcombe and Havelock's boundaries ran deeper and darker than a simple land dispute. He said nothing to Whitmore of what he had learned, choosing instead to watch and wait, but he could not maintain the same silence with Eleanor, not any longer, not when her own safety might now stand within the reach of whatever scheme Colton and Whitmore had built together 6 years before. He rode to Ashcombe that same afternoon, arriving unannounced, and found her in the estate office poring over accounts, her dark hair coming loose from its pins in a way that made her look younger and more tired than her usual composed self allowed. "Something has happened," she said the moment she saw his face, setting down her pen entirely. He told her everything then, the flower at Charlotte's grave, the shape in his garden, Whitmore's careful evasions, Marsh's account of the side door and the wrapped bundle, Tobias's memory of Henry Colton standing in the stable yard the very night the fire began. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, bracing for fear, for doubt, for the kind of polite disbelief that might have ended the conversation there, but she offered none of it. She listened with the same still attention she had shown him at their first meeting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "He has asked me to marry him 3 times since my return," she said finally. "I refused each time, gently at first and then rather less gently, and each refusal seemed to anger him more than the last, as though my answer were not truly mine to give. I thought it simple wounded pride. I did not imagine it might run so much deeper, or reach so much further back. If he was involved in what happened to Charlotte," Edmund said, his voice low, "then your refusal has cost him something he believes he has waited years to secure. A man who would burn a house to remove one obstacle may not hesitate to remove another." Eleanor did not flinch from the implication, though Edmund saw her hands tighten briefly on the edge of the desk. "Then we must be careful," she said, rather than frightened. "I did not survive my own losses by hiding from what threatens me, your grace, and I do not intend to begin now." It was, Edmund thought, exactly the answer he should have expected from her, and something in her steadiness settled the fury in his own chest into something more useful, a sharper, colder resolve rather than blind anger. They spent the remainder of the afternoon together, not in the drawing-room where servants might overhear, but walking the frozen gardens where their voices would carry to no one, piecing together every fragment they had gathered, searching for the thread that connected a 6-year-old fire to a rival's wounded pride and a steward's careful silence. It was Eleanor who first suggested the possibility that turned Edmund's understanding of the entire affair on its head. "What if," she said slowly, "the fire was never meant to harm your wife at all? What if it was meant only to destroy something else, some paper, some proof, and her presence in that room was simply terrible misfortune rather than the intended target?" Edmund stopped walking entirely. "What proof?" he asked. "I do not know," Eleanor admitted. "But you said yourself the fire began in her private sitting room, where she kept her own correspondence and papers. If Whitmore and Colton had some understanding between them, some agreement neither wished discovered, and if your wife had somehow learned of it, whatever it was, then destroying her papers might have seemed to them a simple, contained solution. A tragedy, rather than a confession." The thought settled over Edmund with a horror worse than any he had yet felt, worse even than the suspicion of deliberate harm, because it meant that Charlotte's death might have been not a targeted cruelty, but a careless accident born of someone else's greed. A life extinguished not out of malice toward her, but out of simple, cold indifference to whether she lived or died so long as the papers burned with her. It was, in its own way, a more unbearable thought than murder, and yet it also offered, for the first time in 6 years, the shape of an answer he could pursue, a reason behind the tragedy that might finally be proven, rather than a grief that would remain forever formless and unresolved. "We must find what she knew," Edmund said quietly. "If such papers ever existed, there may yet be some trace of them, some hint of what she had learned, hidden somewhere Whitmore never thought to search." They agreed before the light failed entirely, that Edmund would return to Havelock House and search Charlotte's remaining effects, the few personal items that had survived the fire and been stored away in the years since, untouched by a grief too raw to face them. Eleanor, for her part, promised to make careful, quiet inquiries of her own into the Colton family's finances, using connections from her years abroad that Henry Colton would have no reason to suspect or fear. As Edmund rode home in the fading light, the cold air sharp against his face, he found his mind returning again and again not to Whitmore's betrayal or Colton's ambition, but to the steadiness in Eleanor's voice as she spoke of danger without flinching from it, the quiet strength that had carried her through her own losses and now stood, unhesitating, beside his. He had spent 6 years believing himself incapable of trusting anyone fully again, and yet here he was, riding home through the dark with his heart, however cautiously, already given to a woman he had known properly for less than a fortnight. It frightened him more than Whitmore's secrets or Colton's ambitions ever could, and yet, for the first time since the fire, it was a fear he found himself unwilling to run from. Charlotte's remaining effects had been stored, Edmund discovered upon his return, not in the house itself, but in a small locked room above the old stables, a decision he vaguely recalled making in the earliest days of his grief, unable to bear the sight of her belongings within the walls where she had lived and died. He had not entered that room in 6 years. Hargrove kept the single key on his own ring, and when Edmund asked for it that evening, the old butler's hands trembled slightly as he handed it over, though he said nothing beyond a quiet offer to accompany his master, which Edmund gently declined. The room smelled of dust and old cedar when he finally opened the door, lit only by the lantern he carried, and for a long moment he simply stood in the doorway, unable to make himself step further inside. Trunks lined the walls, her gowns folded within them, her small writing desk pushed into one corner beneath a dust sheet, and the sight of it all struck him with a grief so sudden and complete that he had to steady himself against the doorframe before he could continue. He worked slowly through the trunks first, finding nothing beyond the ordinary sorrow of a life interrupted, gowns she would never wear again, letters from her own family written before their marriage, small trinkets that meant nothing to anyone but her. It was in the writing desk, beneath a false bottom he might never have found had Eleanor's suggestion not sharpened his attention to every possible hiding place, that he discovered a small bundle of papers wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, protected, it seemed, quite deliberately against exactly the kind of fire that had eventually taken her life. His hands shook as he unwrapped them by lantern light. They were letters, several in Charlotte's own hand, drafts it seemed of a correspondence she had never sent, along with 2 documents in a hand he did not recognize, financial records of some kind, dense with figures and names. As he read, slowly and with growing horror, the shape of what his wife had discovered 6 years before began to emerge with terrible clarity. Charlotte, it seemed, had grown concerned in the months before her death about discrepancies in the Havelock accounts, sums that did not match the tenant rolls Whitmore reported, small at first and then not so small, siphoned quietly over several years into an account she had traced, through careful and evidently secret inquiry of her own, to a solicitor in the county town who managed the financial affairs of the Colton family. She had written, in one unsent letter addressed to her own father, of her fear that Whitmore was systematically defrauding the estate in partnership with young Henry Colton, funneling Havelock's wealth quietly into Colton hands in exchange for some arrangement she had not yet fully understood, though she suspected it involved the boundary lands both families had long disputed. She had not sent the letter. Perhaps she had wished to gather more proof first, or perhaps she had simply run out of time before the fire took her. But she had clearly confronted someone with her suspicions, because in the margin of one draft, in her own quick hand, she had written a single unfinished line that made Edmund's blood run cold in the dusty lantern light. I told W today that I know, and he went pale as I have never seen him, and I begin to fear I have made a grave mistake in trusting him with what I know before telling Edmund first. She had told Whitmore. She had confronted her own household steward with proof of his theft, believing perhaps that he would confess or reform, or simply that he deserved the chance to explain himself before she brought the matter to her husband. and within what could only have been hours or at most days of that confrontation, a fire had begun in her private sitting room, destroying, as far as Whitmore could have known, every trace of the evidence she had gathered against him, and taking her life along with it. Edmund sat on the dusty floor of that small locked room for a long time after he finished reading, the lantern guttering low, grief and fury warring in his chest with an intensity he had not allowed himself to feel since the earliest days after her death. It was not, perhaps, quite murder in the way he had first feared, not a deliberate flame set to end her life directly. But it was murder all the same in every way that mattered, a fire set to destroy evidence with reckless indifference to whether the woman who held that evidence lived or died in the flames meant to consume it. Whitmore had known, when he set that fire or arranged for it to be set, that Charlotte might well be in that room. He had chosen the destruction of proof over the safety of the woman who had trusted him for years, and that choice had cost her everything. He carried the papers back to the house himself, wrapped once more in their oiled cloth, and locked them in his own desk rather than risk Whitmore's discovery of what he had found. He did not sleep that night, sitting instead by his study fire with Charlotte's unfinished letter spread before him, reading her final written words again and again, until the ink seemed to blur before his tired eyes. He thought of the 6 years he had spent grieving an accident that was never truly an accident at all, 6 years in which the man responsible had managed his household, offered him quiet comfort, and gently discouraged every question Edmund might otherwise have asked. He rode to Ashcombe at first light, exhausted and hollow-eyed, and Alina took one look at his face before he had even dismounted and drew him inside without a word of ceremony, sending servants away and closing the study door behind them before she would allow him to speak. He told her everything, the papers, the letter, Charlotte's own hand condemning the man Edmund had trusted for 30 years, and Alina listened with a stillness that gave way, by the end of his account, to a quiet fury of her own. He must answer for this, she said, before a magistrate properly, where the law can reach him. Whatever grief this brings you, whatever it costs to see it through, he cannot be allowed to continue managing your household as though nothing has happened. I know, Edmund said, but I fear moving too quickly. If he suspects I know, he may destroy what remains of the evidence, or flee entirely, or worse, turn to Colton for protection before either of them can be properly held to account. I need more than my wife's suspicions and an old groundsman's memory. I need proof a magistrate cannot dismiss. They spent the remainder of that day working together over the papers Edmund had brought, Alina's sharper eye for figures untangling threads in the financial records that Edmund himself had struggled to follow, until between them they had traced a pattern of transfers spanning nearly 7 years. Sums moved from Havelock's tenant rents into an account controlled jointly, it seemed, by Whitmore and the elder Colton, and continued, after the old man's death, by his son Henry. It was, Alina observed grimly, precisely the kind of arrangement that might explain both a fire meant to destroy incriminating evidence and a young man's fierce determination to secure marriage into the Whitfield estate, expanding through matrimony what he could not yet claim through fraud alone. It was as they worked, deep into the afternoon with the fire burned low and the papers spread across Alina's study table, that a servant knocked urgently at the door, breathless and pale, to report that Henry Colton had arrived at Ashcombe unannounced, and was, at that very moment, refusing to be turned away, insisting he would wait in the hall until Miss Whitfield agreed to see him. Alina's face went carefully blank, the same composed stillness Edmund had first noticed at their meeting, though he saw now, having come to know her better, the effort that composure cost her. "I will see him," she said. "Better here where I command the room than to let him believe avoidance means fear." Edmund insisted on remaining nearby, though not visibly present, and took a position in the small adjoining chamber with the door left slightly ajar, close enough to hear every word and near enough to intervene should the conversation turn dangerous. He watched through the narrow gap as Colton was shown into the study, his dark green coat immaculate, his expression carrying a forced pleasantness that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Whitfield," Colton said, "I understand the Duke has been a frequent visitor here of late. I confess I find it rather curious, given his reputation for solitude these 6 years past. One wonders what has drawn him so suddenly back into society. Perhaps he simply enjoys good company, Alina said evenly. As I do, when it is offered without conditions attached. Colton's smile thinned. I had hoped, when you returned to Ashcombe, that we might settle the old understanding between our families properly. My father and yours discussed it for years before either passed. I confess I am rather disappointed to find a newcomer's charm apparently outweighing an old and settled arrangement. There was no settled arrangement, Alina said, her voice cooling further. There was a hope on your father's part, never confirmed by mine, and certainly never agreed to by me. I have told you as much 3 times already, and I find myself weary of telling you a 4th. Colton was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its forced pleasantness entirely, replaced by something harder, colder, closer to the man Edmund had seen watching Alina with tightened jaw at their first meeting. You may find, Miss Whitfield, that some understandings are not so easily set aside as you imagine. My family has held claims on the boundary lands between our estates for generations, claims your father was rather more willing to negotiate than you appear to be. I would think carefully before dismissing an alliance that might resolve those claims peacefully, rather than force a resolution neither of us would enjoy. It was, Edmund understood immediately, a threat delivered with just enough ambiguity to escape open accusation, and he felt his hand tighten on the doorframe, every instinct urging him to step into the room and end the conversation himself. But Alina's voice, when it came, carried no fear at all, only a cold, deliberate warning of her own. I have faced worse threats than a disappointed neighbor's temper, Mr. Colton, she said. I would think carefully yourself before assuming I am the sort of woman who resolves difficulties through marriage rather than through the law, should it come to that. Something in her words seemed to strike Colton more forcefully than she perhaps intended, a flash of genuine alarm crossing his face before he mastered it. And Edmund, watching from the shadowed doorway, understood in that instant that Alina's careful phrase, resolves difficulties through the law, had touched some fear in the man that ran far deeper than wounded pride over a refused proposal. Colton took his leave shortly after, his composure restored but his eyes carrying, as he passed the adjoining door, a brief, searching glance toward the shadow where Edmund stood, as though some instinct told him he had not been entirely alone in that conversation after all. When the door closed behind him, Alina sank into her chair with a long breath, the composure she had held so carefully finally allowed to slip. He knows something is being pursued, she said quietly. I saw it in his face when I mentioned the law. Whatever he and Whitmore built together, he fears its discovery more than he fears losing me, and I do not think, Edmund, that we have very much time left before he decides that fear must be dealt with more directly. Edmund crossed the room and took her hands in his without quite deciding to do so, the gesture arriving before thought could stop it, and found her fingers cold and trembling slightly despite the steadiness of her voice. Then we move quickly, he said, tonight if we must. I will not let either of them touch you, whatever it costs me to prevent it. She looked up at him then, her composure entirely gone, replaced by something rower and more honest than he had yet seen from her. And for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, the danger circling both their houses drawing them, in that silence, closer together than any careful conversation could have managed. By the following morning, word had already begun to spread through the county that the Duke of Havelock had been seen at Ashcombe Manor on more than one occasion, and that Miss Whitfield had, on at least one visit, walked with him alone through the gardens for the better part of an hour. Such details, harmless in themselves, grew teeth in the telling, passed from one drawing-room to another until, by the time Colonel Ashby relayed the gossip to Edmund with evident discomfort, the story had transformed into something considerably less innocent, a whispered suggestion that the grim Duke had found in the new mistress of Ashcombe a rather more willing companion than his 6 years of mourning had ever suggested he sought. Edmund cared little for his own reputation, which had weathered far worse whispers over the years, but he cared a great deal for what such talk might do to Alina, newly returned to a county she had left as a girl, still working to establish herself as mistress of her own restored estate. He rode to Ashcombe that afternoon prepared to apologize for whatever difficulty his attentions had caused her, only to find her entirely unbothered by the gossip itself, though troubled by its likely source. It did not begin by accident, she said, when he raised the matter. Colonel Ashby heard it first from his own housekeeper, who had it from a maid at the Colton estate. I think Henry Colton has decided that if he cannot win me through proposal or through threat, he will attempt to ruin my standing in the county instead, forcing me to depend on an alliance with his family simply to salvage my reputation. It was, Edmund realized with grim admiration for the man's calculation even as fury rose in his chest, a clever move, one that required no direct accusation and left Colton's own hands entirely clean while still applying considerable pressure. He said as much to Alina, and she nodded grimly, already turning her mind toward countermeasures rather than dwelling on the insult itself. Then we must move faster than his rumors can spread, she said. If we can bring proof of his fraud before a magistrate within the week, the gossip becomes irrelevant, a minor cruelty overshadowed by a far greater crime revealed. But if we delay and the whispers grow unchecked, we may find ourselves fighting two battles instead of one. They spent that afternoon and the following 2 days in careful, urgent preparation, Alina's inquiries into the Colton family's finances finally yielding results through a solicitor's clerk in London willing, for a modest sum, to confirm the existence of an account matching precisely the figures found in Charlotte's hidden papers. Edmund, meanwhile, quietly arranged for a respected magistrate from the neighboring county, a man with no particular loyalty to either the Havelock or Colton names, to receive a full account of the evidence gathered, timed carefully to coincide with a public gathering where both Whitmore and Colton would be present, and unable to easily flee or conceal further evidence before the accusation could be formally made. It was Hargrove, in the end, who nearly undid their careful timing. The old butler, sensing the tension building in the household and perhaps guessing more of the truth than Edmund had intended to reveal, came to his master's study on the evening before the planned confrontation, his composed face carrying an expression of genuine distress Edmund had rarely seen from him. "Your Grace," he said, "I have served this house faithfully for 30 years, and I beg you to believe that whatever Mr. Whitmore has done, I had no part in it and no knowledge of it until these recent days made certain things clear to me that I had long refused to examine too closely." Edmund studied his old butler carefully, weighing the man's evident sincerity against the cautions 6 years of grief and now days of betrayal had taught him. "What do you know, Hargrove?" he asked quietly. "I know that Mr. Whitmore has grown increasingly agitated these past weeks," Hargrove said. "I know he has sent several letters to a solicitor in the county town under conditions of unusual secrecy, and I know that 2 nights ago I saw him walking toward the eastern boundary well after midnight, in the direction of the Colton estate, though he claimed the following morning to have slept undisturbed through the entire night." It confirmed what Edmund had already suspected, that Whitmore and Colton, sensing the danger closing around them, had begun communicating urgently, perhaps planning some final desperate measure to protect themselves before the evidence against them could be formally presented. He thanked Hargrove for his honesty and found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, believing the old man entirely innocent of the deeper conspiracy, a loyal servant who had perhaps chosen, like Edmund himself in the early years of his grief, not to look too closely at things he feared to find. "Watch him carefully," Edmund told Hargrove. "Say nothing of what has passed between us, and if he attempts to leave the house suddenly or receives any further correspondence, I must know of it immediately." That same night, unable to sleep with the confrontation now only a day away, Edmund walked once more to the family plot at the edge of his gardens, standing beside Charlotte's headstone in the cold moonlight as he had done the night the flower first appeared. He spoke to her quietly, foolishly perhaps, telling her what he had learned, what he intended to do, and found some measure of peace in the telling that 6 years of silent grief had never provided. It was there, in the deep quiet of that frozen garden, that he heard movement behind the stone wall, quick and deliberate, and turned in time to see a figure in dark clothing moving swiftly along the boundary hedge, too far to identify clearly but moving with a purpose that told him immediately this was no accidental wanderer. He gave chase, his heart pounding, boots slipping on frost-hardened ground, but the figure was faster, or knew the terrain better, and vanished over the eastern boundary before Edmund could close the distance, exactly as the earlier intruder had done. He returned to the house breathless and furious, waking Hargrove immediately to report what he had seen, and it was only the following morning, when a groundsman discovered that the small locked room above the stables had been disturbed, its door forced, and several of Charlotte's old trunks searched hastily and left in disarray, that the full danger of the previous night's intrusion became clear. Whoever had entered, whether Colton himself or some agent sent on his behalf, had been searching for exactly the papers Edmund had already removed and locked away in his own desk, and had found, to their evident fury, nothing at all. "They know we have found something," Edmund told Alina when he rode to Ashcombe that same morning, "and no, we intend to use it. We can no longer wait for the gathering planned for tomorrow. If Colton believes the evidence already lost to him, he may act with far less caution than he has shown thus far." Alina's face, when he described the intrusion, carried an anger sharper than any fear, and she agreed immediately that their timeline must move forward, that the magistrate must be summoned that very day rather than waiting for the planned gathering to provide cover for the confrontation. But even as they made these hurried arrangements, a message arrived at Ashcombe that changed the shape of the danger entirely, a brief note delivered by an unfamiliar rider, addressed to Alina in a hand she did not recognize, containing only a few cold words that made her face go pale as she read them aloud to Edmund. "Your father's papers proved troublesome to a friend of mine some years ago. I trust you will consider carefully whether you wish to follow the same path he did, before you take any further steps against those who have only ever wished your family well." It was signed with no name at all, but the meaning was unmistakable, a warning delivered with the same chilling precision as the flower left at Charlotte's grave, a reminder that whoever stood behind Colton and Whitmore's conspiracy understood exactly how far they had already gone to protect their secret, and exactly how far they remained willing to go again. The threat did not frighten Alina into stillness, as whoever sent it had clearly hoped it would. If anything, it hardened her resolve, and within the hour she had dispatched her own rider to the magistrate. Edmund had already quietly engaged, requesting his presence at Havelock House that very evening rather than waiting for the following day as originally planned. Edmund, for his part, sent word to Colonel Ashby and 2 other respected gentlemen of the county, men whose presence would lend weight and witness to whatever confrontation the evening might bring, and by late afternoon a small but significant gathering had begun to assemble at Havelock House under the pretext of an informal dinner, though every person present understood by then that something far more serious than conversation awaited them. Whitmore, summoned to attend as though the evening were entirely ordinary, arrived in the drawing-room with his usual composed bearing, though Edmund saw, watching him closely now with eyes that understood exactly what to look for, the faint tension in his jaw, the too careful stillness of his hands. He had served this family for 30 years, and whatever guilt he carried, Edmund thought, he wore it now like a man walking toward a gallows he had built with his own hands and simply refused, until this moment, to look at directly. The magistrate arrived shortly before the appointed hour, a stern, unhurried man named Justice Pembroke, who listened without visible reaction as Edmund laid out, in the presence of Colonel Ashby and the assembled witnesses, the full account of what had been discovered, Charlotte's hidden papers, the pattern of stolen funds traced to an account shared between Whitmore and the Colton family, the testimony of Marsh and old Tobias regarding the night of the fire, and finally the threatening note delivered to Alina only hours before. Whitmore's composure held through nearly the entire account, his face carefully arranged into an expression of wounded confusion, as though the accusations were simply too absurd to merit real concern. It was only when Edmund read aloud Charlotte's own unfinished words. "I told W today that I know," and he went pale as I have never seen him, that something in the old steward finally broke entirely, his careful mask crumbling into something raw and desperate that no 30 years of practiced service could disguise. "I never meant for her to be harmed," he said, his voice breaking, the room falling utterly silent around him. "You must believe that, Your Grace, whatever else you believe of me. When she confronted me, I panicked. I went to Colton because I did not know what else to do, because he had as much to lose as I did if the accounts were discovered, and he told me the papers must be destroyed before she could act on what she knew. I did not know she meant to remain in that room that night. I swear before God I did not know." The confession, once begun, poured out of him in a flood the assembled witnesses could scarcely follow, years of guilt and careful silence collapsing all at once. He had indeed diverted funds from the estate over several years, a slow and initially modest scheme that had grown, with Colton's encouragement and eventual partnership, into something far larger than Whitmore himself had ever intended. When Charlotte discovered the discrepancies and confronted him directly, hoping, in her own words as she had written, that he might confess and reform rather than be exposed, he had gone instead to Colton in desperate fear, and it was Colton, not Whitmore himself, who had arranged for the fire, believing or claiming to believe, that Charlotte would be safely elsewhere in the house when it began. "I did not set the flame myself," Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "But I knew what he intended, and I said nothing to stop him, and that is a guilt I have carried every day since, a guilt no confession can ever truly lift from me." Justice Pembroke's face remained grave and unmoved throughout the confession, and when Whitmore finally fell silent, exhausted by the weight of 6 years finally set down, the magistrate spoke with the calm authority of a man who had heard every manner of human weakness, and would judge this one according to the law rather than pity. "You will be held for trial, Mr. Whitmore, on charges of fraud and complicity in the death that resulted from your silence," he said. "As for Mr. Colton, I will require a warrant executed immediately, before word of this evening's events can reach him and grant him opportunity to flee." It was at that precise moment, as though summoned by his own name, that a commotion arose at the front of the house, raised voices and the sound of hurried footsteps, and moments later a breathless footman burst into the drawing-room to report that Henry Colton had arrived unannounced, apparently having learned already, through some channel none of them could yet trace, that his conspiracy was unraveling that very evening. Colton entered the room himself moments later, brushing past the footman who attempted to delay him, his face flushed with a fury that had entirely abandoned the careful pleasantness he had worn at every previous meeting. His eyes found Whitmore first, slumped and broken in his chair, and something like contempt flickered across his features before his gaze swept to Edmund and finally to Alina, who had arrived at Havelock only shortly before the confrontation began, and now stood near the window, watching him with a composure that seemed to enrage him further. "You have ruined everything," Colton said, his voice low and shaking with barely restrained violence, directed at no one and everyone at once. 6 years of careful management, undone in a single evening because a grieving fool finally decided to stop feeling sorry for himself and start asking questions he had no business asking. Justice Pembroke rose from his seat, his authority evident despite his measured tone. "Mr. Colton, you are under arrest for fraud and for complicity in the death of the Duchess of Havelock. I would advise you to surrender yourself quietly, for your own sake as much as anyone else's." Colton's eyes darted around the room, calculating, and for a moment Edmund feared the man might attempt something desperate, a lunge toward the door, or worse, toward Alina herself, whom he clearly blamed in some twisted fashion for the unraveling of his careful scheme. But Colonel Ashby and 2 of the other gentlemen present moved quickly to block the doorway, and whatever violent impulse crossed Colton's face in that moment seemed, at last, to recognize the futility of resistance. "This is not finished," he said, as 2 of Justice Pembroke's men took hold of his arms, his voice carrying more venom than genuine threat now that his fate had been sealed. "Whatever you believe you have won tonight, Ashworth, You have won nothing but a grave already dug, and a woman who will learn soon enough what it costs to stand beside you." Edmund crossed the room before he had quite decided to move, placing himself between Colton and Alina, with a stillness that carried more warning than any raised voice could have managed. "Take him away," he said quietly to Pembroke's men, and Colton was led out, still muttering threats that grew fainter and less coherent as the distance between them increased, until the front door closed behind him, and the house fell, at last, into a profound and exhausted silence. Justice Pembroke remained a while longer, arranging the practical details of Whitmore's custody and the formal charges to be filed against both men, and it was well past midnight before the last of the witnesses departed and Havelock House emptied of everyone but its own household, and standing quietly near the drawing-room fire, Alina Whitfield, who had not yet found a moment alone with Edmund since the confrontation began. 6 years, he said finally, once the door had closed on the last departing guest, and they stood alone together in the flickering firelight. 6 years I believed her death an accident I could do nothing about, and grieved it as such, when the truth was there all along, waiting for someone brave enough to look for it. You looked for it the moment you allowed yourself to hope again, Alina said gently. That is not a small thing, Edmund. Grief alone would have kept you asking nothing at all, exactly as it did for 6 years before I arrived with an old promise and an invitation you very nearly discarded. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in the quiet aftermath of a night that had unmade and remade so much at once, and felt something in his chest ease that had been clenched tight since the moment Hargrove first handed him that silver-edged card. The truth about Charlotte's death would never bring her back, and the grief of 6 years would not simply vanish because justice had finally been served. But standing there in the firelight with Alina Whitfield, who had walked into his shuttered life with nothing more than a childhood promise and refused, from the very first moment, to let him hide from it, Edmund Ashworth felt, for the first time since the fire, something that was not quite happiness but stood very close beside it, patient and steady, waiting for him to finally, fully, let it in. The weeks that followed passed in a strange blend of exhaustion and quiet relief, as the formal machinery of justice moved through its slow and necessary course. Whitmore's trial, when it came, was brief and largely uncontested, his own confession forming the backbone of a case Justice Pembroke had already assembled with meticulous care. He was sentenced to transportation rather than the gallows, a mercy the court extended in recognition of his eventual confession and the absence of any proof that he had struck the flame himself. Though Edmund privately doubted the distinction, offered Whitmore much comfort in the years of hard labor that awaited him across the sea. Henry Colton's trial proved considerably more contentious, his family's standing in the county affording him legal counsel determined to argue that no direct evidence placed his hand upon the fire itself, only Whitmore's own testimony regarding a conversation neither Marsh nor Tobias had directly witnessed. But the financial records Alina had helped trace, confirmed independently by the solicitor's clerk in London, proved damning enough on the charge of fraud alone, and when combined with Whitmore's detailed account of Colton's role in ordering the fire, the jury found little difficulty reaching a verdict. Colton was sentenced to transportation as well, his estate seized to repay the sums stolen from Havelock over the years, the eastern boundary dispute that had driven so much of his ambition rendered, in the end, entirely irrelevant since he would never again set foot on English soil to press his claim. Edmund felt no particular satisfaction watching either man led away in chains, only a quiet, hollow relief that the truth had finally been dragged into the light after 6 long years of darkness, and a grief for Charlotte that the trials had somehow made both sharper and more bearable at once. Sharper because he now understood precisely what had been taken from her and why, and more bearable because the not knowing, which had haunted him longer than the loss itself, had finally been laid to rest. Hargrove, in the aftermath, offered his resignation twice, convinced that his failure to recognize Whitmore's guilt sooner represented a betrayal of his own duties, and twice Edmund refused to accept it, telling the old butler plainly that 30 years of honest service could not be undone by a crime committed by another man entirely. Marsh received a generous pension, in recognition of the courage it had taken to finally speak the truth he had carried silently for 6 years. And old Tobias, whose sharp memory had provided the final thread connecting Colton to that terrible night, was moved into a comfortable cottage nearer the main house, where Edmund made a point of visiting him personally at least once each month. A small kindness that seemed to please the old groundsman more than any greater reward could have. Through all of it, Alina remained a steady presence at Edmund's side, not as a distraction from his grief, but as a companion within it, understanding, in a way few others could, that justice for Charlotte and happiness for himself were not competing claims on his heart but two halves of the same slow healing. Their courtship, which had begun with a childhood promise called due, deepened through those difficult weeks into something neither of them any longer bothered to disguise from the county's watchful eyes. And when Edmund finally asked her, on a bright, cold morning in the same gardens where he had once found a stranger's flower pressed into frost, she answered him with the same directness that had first drawn him to her at Ashcombe Manor, without hesitation and without artifice. "I would be a poor student of promises if I refused this one," she said, "when I have spent so much effort collecting the first." Their wedding, held that spring at Havelock House, drew rather more attention from the county than either of them entirely welcomed. Curiosity about the grim Duke's sudden transformation mingling with genuine warmth from those who had watched him disappear into grief 6 years before and now saw him, however cautiously, beginning to live again. The ballroom, closed and shuttered since the night of the fire, was opened for the first time in 6 years, its dust sheets removed, its chandeliers lit anew, and Edmund stood in the doorway on the morning of the celebration with Alina's hand in his, looking at the room where Charlotte had once loved to dance, feeling grief and gladness settle into something that no longer felt like a contradiction. That evening, as the orchestra Alina had arranged began to play, Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Havelock, led his new wife onto the floor of a ballroom he had not entered in 6 years, and danced properly, for the first time since the fire had taken everything he thought he understood about his own life. He was not, he would admit later with a rare and easy laugh, quite as clumsy as he had been at 17 on a summer lawn, though Alina assured him, teasingly, that there remained considerable room for practice yet. The guests who watched them turn slowly around the restored ballroom floor saw only a duke finally emerging from long mourning into new happiness. But Edmund himself felt something far larger in that dance. 6 years of silence finally broken not by forgetting the past, but by carrying it forward honestly, grief and love standing together at last rather than apart. Charlotte's memory did not fade from Havelock House that night, nor in any of the years that followed. Edmund visited her grave still regularly, and spoke to her sometimes in the quiet of the garden much as he had the night he first found the flower pressed into frost, though he understood now, with a clarity 6 years of silence had denied him, that the flower had never been a warning from the past but rather, he came to believe, some strange and gentle mercy, a nudge from grief itself toward the truth he had needed to find, and toward the life he had needed, eventually, to reclaim. The card that arrived at his door that winter, cream-colored and edged in silver, remained tucked within the pages of his private ledger for the rest of his life, a small and constant reminder that even the longest silence could be broken by a single act of courage, whether it came in the shape of an old promise called due, or a woman unafraid to knock on a door everyone else had long since stopped approaching. 3 years passed, and Havelock House became, in that time, a place scarcely recognizable to those who remembered the shuttered, silent estate it had been during the years of Edmund's mourning. The ballroom that had stood dark for 6 years now hosted gatherings each season, modest ones at first, then gradually larger as the county grew accustomed to seeing warmth and laughter where they had long expected only cold formality. Alina took to the management of the household with the same steady competence she had once brought to the restoration of Ashcombe Manor, and between the two estates, now managed jointly under careful new stewards recommended by Colonel Ashby himself, Havelock prospered in ways it had not since long before the fire. A daughter arrived in their 2nd year of marriage, a small, dark-haired girl they named Charlotte, a decision Edmund made with some hesitation, uncertain whether it honored his first wife's memory or burdened his second with an impossible shadow to live beneath. But Alina had insisted gently that the name carried love rather than comparison, and watching his daughter grow through her early years, quick-eyed and stubborn in exactly the way her mother had been at that same age on a summer lawn long ago, Edmund found the choice had brought only comfort, never grief. Old Tobias lived long enough to see the child take her first uncertain steps across the same gardens where he had once tended roses for a different duchess. And he told Edmund, on one of their monthly visits, that watching new life move through those grounds again had done more to settle his own conscience than any confession ever could have. Marsh wrote occasionally from the coaching inn, contented letters describing a life rebuilt on honest footing, and Hargrove, who had remained at Havelock through every difficulty, grew visibly younger. Alina liked to tease him, with each passing season of renewed happiness in the house he had served for so many quiet, grieving years. News reached them only rarely of Whitmore and Colton, both men serving out their sentences far across the ocean, and Edmund found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he thought of them less and less as the years passed. The space they had once occupied in his mind slowly filled instead with the small, ordinary joys of a life he had never expected to reclaim. He did not forgive them, not entirely, but he found he no longer needed to carry their betrayal as the central weight of his days, having set it down at last in a courtroom 3 years before and never quite picked it back up again. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, with their daughter finally asleep and the fire burning low in the same study, where he had once spent a sleepless night turning a silver-edged card over and over in his hands, that Alina found him standing at the window looking out toward the family plot, as he still did occasionally, though with far less of the old grief and far more of a settled, grateful peace. "You are thinking of her again," Alina said, coming to stand beside him, no accusation in her voice, only a familiar gentleness. "I think of her often," he admitted, "but differently now. I used to think of her only through the lens of what I lost. Now I think of her through everything that followed, the truth we found, the daughter who carries her name, the life we built from what might have remained only ruin. I think she would be glad of it, strange as that sounds." "I do not think it strange at all," Alina said. "Grief and gladness were never meant to live apart from each other, Edmund. I think you understood that better than most, once you finally let yourself feel both at once." He turned from the window and looked at his wife, 3 years married now and still, in quiet moments like this one, capable of striking him with the same simple honesty that had first drawn him across a ballroom floor he had avoided for 6 long years. He thought of the promise that had begun it all, a clumsy dance on a summer lawn between 2 children who could not have imagined the winding, difficult road that promise would eventually demand of them both, and felt a gratitude so complete it left him briefly unable to speak. "Dance with me," he said instead, holding out his hand though no orchestra played and no ballroom waited beyond the study door. Alina laughed, the sound warm and unguarded in the firelit quiet, and placed her hand in his without hesitation, exactly as she had every single time he had asked her anything in the 3 years since that terrible, transformative winter began. "There is no music," she said, though she was already moving into his arms as she said it. "There has not been for 6 years before you arrived either," he said, "and somehow we managed well enough." They danced slowly, clumsily, laughing softly at missteps neither of them minded in the least, in a quiet study lit by a single fire, in a house that had once held nothing but silence and grief, and now held in every corner Edmund looked, the steady, ordinary, hard-won warmth of a life he had once believed could never belong to him again. The card that had arrived at his door that long-ago winter night remained, still, tucked within his private ledger, a small and permanent reminder that sometimes the smallest arrivals, an unfamiliar writer in the dark, a childhood promise finally called due, could unravel 6 years of silence and lead, however winding and dangerous the road between, toward exactly the kind of happiness a grieving man had long since stopped believing he deserved to find.